Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here in Sprague Hall for this conversation between our president of Yale, Peter Salovey, and our distinguished guest, conductor of Philharmonia for this next concert, John Adams. I also want to welcome our streaming audience throughout the world, and we are especially appreciative that you would come in and attempt to stay dry on a very, very rainy day here in New Haven. I am sitting on the stage with two Californians and two people who grew up playing the clarinet. Those are distinguished common threads that they have. But first of all, I wanted to say just a very few words about our president, who is Yale's 23rd president. But President Salovey has concentrated much of his career here and served in distinguished leadership positions, beginning as chair of the Department of Psychology, later the dean of Yale College, the dean of the graduate school, provost, and then president. But more importantly, for us at least, he is a person who loves music and a performing musician himself, very active in bluegrass music making and creating. And he has always been a friend of music at Yale, and it's particularly good to have a president at a university that has great music participation, and we're delighted you're here, Peter.
Thank you so much, Steve.
John Adams is a longtime friend of Yale. Most recently, Yale honored him with its highest distinction, that of an honorary doctorate. But he has been on the Yale campus numerous times. He is one of America's great composers today. And we're delighted to have you here. I'm not going to take a lot of time because I know our audience wants to hear what you both have to say. The president's research and teaching interest through the years has been emotional intelligence. John Adams is not only a famous and distinguished composer, but also a conductor, and most of all, a creative thinker. And I wanted to have you two talk for a moment about the importance and the role of emotional intelligence and creativity and their intersections. And Mr. President, I'll ask you to start off.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dean Blocker. First of all, thank you all for coming today. For the local audience, the weather is terrible, and we appreciate your willingness to get wet to join us today. And for those watching on the web, thank you for joining us. And of course, to our very special guest, thank you, John, for joining us. We really appreciate all that you're doing during your time here at Yale. So I do study human emotion as a psychologist. Although I played clarinet as a child, it took me in a different direction than it took John. But as a psychologist, I became very interested in why we have an emotional system, and what it does for us, and how it affects other aspects of our psyche, what we think about, what we pay attention to, what we feel, decisions we make. And this led over time to a kind of theory about how people differ in their ability to use the information that their emotions provide to them. And we began to call those differences emotional intelligence. So, Robert, you asked me the connection between emotional intelligence and creativity. So we think of emotional intelligence as largely four sets of skills: the ability to identify emotions, the ability to understand them, put them in language, communicate about them, the ability to regulate them, to try to feel something that you're enjoying even more, or maybe if you're a musician, to regulate your anxiety or stage fright or nervousness. That's all regulation. But the last skill is how to use your emotions to solve problems, to make decisions, to be even more creative. And that's an unusual idea. How do you draw on your emotions? And it's an unusual idea for a psychologist to talk about. I bet artists can talk about it quite a bit. And I won't go on too long because I want to hear what they have to say. But one of the things that our emotions do for us is they give us a kind of different filters or different lenses for seeing the world. The world looks different to us depending on what we're feeling at the time that we're perceiving it. And if we can capture that, if you can harness that in some way, to recognize that, to allow myself to feel whatever I'm feeling, but then to observe while in that state, I'm going to come to different conclusions. It's almost like putting a different lens on a camera, or a different filter on that lens, or looking at something standing on one's head versus right side up. It's going to look different. And so one of the aspects of emotions that we try to study is, how do you capture the different perspectives that different emotions give you on the world? And some people do this quite well, and for others, it's, what are you talking about? I would never do something like that. That doesn't make any sense to me. Well, that's emotional intelligence. That's the difference.
And in creativity, in that intersection from your perspective.
It took me decades to realize a very obvious fact, which is that music is essentially about feeling. I came of age as a composer during a period when intellectual and rational activity was highly valued. Those of us who are musicians in the audience certainly have heard of 12-tone music and serialism and chants music and aleatoric. These were all, devices designed to, to push music into different formal patterns, and actually also into very different expressive modes. And music, since it can be quantified, it is, after all, molecules banging against one another, and you can see it on an oscilloscope. You can quantify it by pitch, by rhythm. It can lend itself, probably more than any other art form, to a more rational organization. And so you do have composers, like composers in the Middle Age who wrote isometric canons, and even Bach, who could do everything. He could write a profoundly emotional work like the St. Matthew Passion, and then turn around and write these fugues or canons that were on a single staff, and you could apply a treble clef or a bass clef, and you could turn it upside down, and no matter how you did it, if you performed it with somebody else, it worked perfectly, because he had that kind of intellectual command. But I think the bottom line about music is that it communicates feeling, and it does it in a way that no other art form quite can do. And I don't know if it was James Joyce or... No, it wasn't. It was the 19th century art historian. The name escapes me right now. But he said that all the arts aspire to music. And I believe, in a sense, they do, because they believe that music is capable of being formally perfect, but also being the most expressive emotionally of all the art forms.
In the laboratory, when we used to do research on how emotions affect other aspects of the psyche, we'd have to arouse great emotions in the lab. And that's hard to do ethically, right? I mean, think about it for just a minute. There's lots of things I could do in the lab that would create an emotional expression, but for the most part, the committees that evaluate experiments don't want you to do them.
Could they just watch Fox News?
So, well, yes, that would work. That would work. But the most reliable way we would induce an emotional experience was through music.
Yeah.
And some of it is idiosyncratic. What you find joyful, you might not. But there were also pieces that would have a characteristic emotional aspect to them, emotional reaction to them. And I remember we would try to arouse great sorrow in the lab. And there was a Prokofiev piece called Russia Under the Mongolian Yoke. The title itself suggests great sorrow. And we would slow it down and play it at half speed. I didn't invent this. This came from another lab. And people would just weep. And then you would test their memory or whatever a psychologist you wanted to. But it was really remarkable that people walk in happy, and we could manipulate their feelings so readily and so reliably, and so consistently across people. People just always responded to this piece in this way.
So from the lab to the role of the creative artist. In an international university, and particularly a distinguished international research university like Yale, the arts here have always been important to the university and to the university's life and externally what happens. But what is the role of the creative artist in a great international research university, and how do we unlock creativity? And we'll start with you, John.
I had to see who he was looking at.
Well, actually, I'm an outsider. I don't teach, so coming to a university it's a real treat for me, and. Gosh, I don't know how to answer that question. I think that the arts. People who are not attuned to the arts think that we creative people are we're very spontaneous, and that we wake up at 3 a.m. and grab a piece of manuscript paper and write a brilliant idea, and then go for months without doing anything, and then make something incredible overnight. But really, actually, being a creative artist is incredibly labor intensive, and every worthy composer or painter or choreographer or sculptor that I know works banker's hours and then some. I work every day, sometimes 7 days a week. It's probably not healthy, but it's just it's a combination of obsession and just the amount of work that has to be done. Because, if you're designing a big skyscraper, you can farm out the heating system to somebody, and the security system to somebody, and the structural calculation to somebody else. But when you're a composer, you have to do all of that. So it is an act of great discipline. So I think that the university can foster that kind of ethic through through example, through its teaching, and also just the mix of people. Because when you get outside of the university, you can become very isolated, and it's just wonderful to be within a university setting where there is not just the cliched exchange of ideas, but there's a lot more of a critical environment. And a critical environment, I told the young composers this morning, I walked into the room and there were about 20 of them, and I said, I'm scared of you guys. and the reason is because when I was 22, I was really mean. Nobody could pass through the the eye of my needle. I had a problem with every composer, and so I knew how critical that was. But it also can be a very positive thing that young people having very, very high ideals and looking up to their professors and to the people that come and visit. So, it provides a a proper kind of fertile ground for invention and imagination.
You know, expanding a little bit on creativity, and Peter, you have an institutional memory about the role of creativity at Yale, why it's been important. But now as president and in a digital age, what is your thought about the significance of creativity to this university and to higher education in general, and how do the arts interface with that in a meaningful way?
Yeah, thanks. It's an excellent question. Let me take a step back and just add something to what John was saying about why we even have arts at a great research university. Two quick thoughts about that. The first is I used to go to a reception, an annual reception at Yale that featured, and I can't even remember why, but it featured the varsity football team and the Yale Opera students. And they would come together and interact with each other.
It's an interesting idea.
Exactly. Penny Lawrence put this together. And those of you who know her. And what was very interesting is I think it was to get groups of people who, the belief was they didn't know each other. As it turned out, actually, more of them knew each other than you would think, and more of them were familiar with what each other did than you might think stereotypically. And but what they would quickly discover is how similar their lives were. Their lives were characterized by a passion about what they were doing, a kind of almost obsession with it, but then to do it well, incredible self-discipline, and having to work at it every day, and they realized that whatever stereotypes you had about how great art is created, or how athletes engage in their task, it was all hard work, and it all required, and it was all self-discipline, and a certain amount of it was teamwork too. So anyway, I think one of the answers to the question is that great arts on a university campus, remind us of how hard it is to do something fantastic, and how much discipline and hard work that requires. So that's sort of one answer. Next answer is a thought about a conversation I was having, I believe, with our 4 wonderful deans of arts schools at Yale. 3 of them named Robert and 1 named James. We have such great schools of art, architecture, drama, and music here, in part because we have great leadership, and we were of them. And we were having this conversation, and one of the deans said, people need to see students and faculty who spend their lives trying to create something that has never existed before, because it will inspire them to do the same in fields that are quite distant from the arts. And that kind of inspiration and translation is why we're here. And of course, we're here to also learn about art, architecture, theater, music, but we're also here to inspire greatness in other fields. I love that example too. But you asked me a different question. You asked me why. Yeah, repeat. This is the problem, right, with becoming middle-aged and talking a lot. You forget the original.
Maybe I forgot the question.
No.
Why creativity is important to the university,
yes.
and particularly in this age.
So this is yes. Thank you. So I spent years serving on tenure and appointment committees, and on those committees, one of the things we would always ask ourselves, not just, is this person hardworking, or has this person contributed a long line of whatever it was, literary criticism, experiments, artistic creation, but is this person having impact? Is this person changing their field? Better yet, is this person changing the world? And I just don't think you can do that by sort of traveling the same roads that everybody else traveled. There may be nothing wrong with that. You can maybe make a wonderful contribution, but I think we have to have arts on university campuses, in part because of the continued challenge to do something different, to just both while still being respectful of what has come before, and you know, you're such a great example of this, totally immersed in what has come before, and then saying, but I'm now going to set out on a completely different road. I'm going to do something you've never seen before, you know, an opera on Nixon going to China. You know, I mean, it's just so, right? And I think that's what the arts on a campus like Yale do. The pressures to conformity are high. The pressures in my field, in academic psychology, to just follow in the footsteps of a mentor or of the expectations of a field are high. And you can actually kind of have a not bad career doing that. But the truly great ones are the ones who say, I understand that, I've studied that, I've looked at it. I mean, I'm respectful of it. Yeah, you don't have to reject it. But now I'm going down my own road. And I think the arts help us do that.
Let's talk about that just a minute, because a couple of years ago, actually it's been a little bit longer than that, when you were provost, you would come and install our entering class.
Yeah.
And after we had done, you know, the installation script, you improvised a little bit. You said, let's talk about flow. I'm a musician. I want to talk about flow. When you described that process for you, where you really are creating something different at a particular time. And I'm curious about both of you talking about this flow, this zone, and especially from a composer's perspective, when you find this well full within you and something just has to come out. How does this work for both of you? And you may want to give us a little prelude by recapturing your explanation of flow.
So flow is actually an idea developed by a psychologist named Mike Csikszentmihalyi, and he was at the University of Chicago and then went to California. He was at Chicago when he began writing on flow. And he made the observation, he said, you know, most people in life are either anxious or bored. Most of our time on earth is spent either being anxious or bored. Why is that? Well, we have certain internal resources that we bring to every situation, and the situation makes demands on us. And if those demands come in hot and heavy and our resources might be limited, we get anxious. But if we have a lot to offer, we have our resources, but the situation isn't making much demand on us, we're bored. So he always used the example of watching mindless television as bored, right? You're not being asked much to do much, and you have so much more to give, and so you're bored. So he said what you have to do to have this experience of flow, where you're in the moment, something is just coming out of you, you feel that you're giving it your all, is get what you have in you, the resources, your resources, and the demands of what you're doing in a perfect balance. And you won't feel anxious, you won't feel bored, you will just feel that time is standing still or passing by very quickly, but you're unconscious of it, you're not aware of it. And you'll be at your most creative. So when I talked to the entering class, I said, you know, in these kind of positions we all have, we do oscillate a lot between anxiety. I had a day yesterday in New York where by the end of the day, I must have done about 12, 14 meetings, and they were all intense, and I had briefing materials for all of them. And, you know, by meeting number 12, you know, I'm confusing what I read. I was kind of anxious because it was demand, or being bored. You know, you're not being challenged. And so that we need to find in life times when where these are in balance. So for me, one of the reasons why I took up music as an adult, Robert was far too generous calling me a musician. I would never say that. But clarinet I learned how to play through conventional instruction. But the double bass I play by ear. And I play it with other students and faculty who like bluegrass and old-time acoustic Appalachian music. And the only way I can play this thing, and you know, this is not complicated music, right? This is 3 chords and the truth. that Bill Monroe, I think, said that. There's 3 chords and the truth. And the basic bass line in bluegrass music, you can do all kinds of things, but the basic is root and fifth. And you just play 1 and 5. If you play 1 and 5, you're not getting in anybody's way. And just switch chords when everybody else switches chords, But, and then you move from there. Everything builds from there. And the only way I can do this, not having any training on this instrument, and playing with 4 other people who are always far better musicians than I am, the only way I can do this is to really concentrate on what I'm doing, be totally in the moment, to play music that takes everything I got to play it, but no more and no less. And in that moment, I find flow. I mean, that is flow. Time runs by. I have no idea. Did we just play for 3 hours straight without taking a break? How did we do that? Right? And I can't, if I think about anything else, I make mistakes, I screw up the rest of the band, because I need all of my capacity, my internal resources to it. It's a great experience, but it probably is also the key to creativity. If you're not in that state, you're probably not at your peak.
So, as a composer, your flow, your zone is obviously different. But describe, if you...
I don't think so.
Okay, well, good. Well,
I'm bored and anxious all the time.
right now?
I think there's, unless you've been, spent several years at a Zen monastery and have reached Satori, that you always have a homunculus that's breathing things into your psyche and disturbing the flow. And I actually, I can't even describe, because, I think I was talking earlier about work habits, and work habits are extremely important for me. I think that, I often say to people, they ask me about inspiration, and I say that if I'm in shape, it's very much like being an athlete. If you're in shape, those things tend to come. They don't always come, but they tend to come more regularly. I mean, if you don't do it every day, and obviously travel is, I would say, 2 things: compulsive traveling or required traveling, and the other thing, of course, is electronic communications. Those are the 2 really deeply disturbing distractions in our time. So getting to a mental space, I guess you call it the flow, getting to a mental space where ideas come is a struggle. I understand why great jazz performers got hooked on drugs, because they it was such a spontaneous act, great jazz, but also it involves such incredible mental activity to negotiate those chord changes and to come up with beautiful improvisations that any kind of mental distraction could get in the way, and drugs would keep you kind of focused. So I wish I had a easy soundbite of how I do it, because I don't always succeed. Working at the same time every day is very helpful. I think the hardest thing for me is getting a piece going. I accept a commission. I say, I really want to write a string quartet next, or a wonderful performer like a pianist or a conductor asks for a piece, and I can't say no. And then when I actually sit down, I don't have, the idea I thought I had is terrible. And then you're in this humiliating situation of being a well-known composer and not having any ideas. And the one phrase that I just am so grateful for is beginner's mind. And I have to be willing, when I start a work, to submit to beginner's mind. And it's humiliating, believe me. I mean, you can win every prize in the book and, you know, be honored and on, and then you're alone with yourself in that room, and what you're doing is not even worthy of a 5-year-old. I mean, you wouldn't believe how humiliating it is to be in this room. You know, you make sure the doors are closed, and you're banging away or trying to sing something and croaking, and it just sounds horrific, and it's terrible, and you can't believe that you wrote that opera, or, you know, all those pieces that, you know, that people are playing, and here you are just being a fool and an idiot. But you just have to go to that level of abject humility to finally get to a point of being receptive. And then, you know, then the ideas, they don't always, but they eventually come. And usually when they come, they're dressed in extremely shabby clothes, and you don't even recognize them. It's like some you know, Christian morality play or something. You don't know it's Jesus under the rags or something, and you know, you kind of have to go with it. And frequently I just say, well, I guess you're going to be the one, and I wish you were cuter, but we got to go with it. And then, you know, and then it sort of grows, and then it becomes sort of like a Petri dish. You know, the ideas begin to coalesce, and then the creative act at a really interesting point becomes more like being a gardener, where you kind of let it grow, you let it follow its own genotype, but you have to know where to trim it, and you have to know where to feed it. And that involves intuitive taste and judgment.
Thank you. Someone had said at one time that America's universities and colleges are America's Medici for the arts, that in 3,000 plus institutions you have museums, art galleries, music departments, this incredible investment and encouragement in the arts. As you look ahead, particularly, John, and survey this landscape of classical music, how do you see the landscape evolving? And for both of you, what is our role in looking at the curricula that best prepares the really, really talented young artist that can be the artist of the future for the world?
Well, I always avoid those questions about the future, and my answer is I could no more say what's going to happen to music than Brahms could have predicted the electric guitar. And, you know, the arts really do, they respond to technological advances. I mean, you know, it's an interplay between technological advance and artistic evolution. But if you look at the invention of the piano, you know, the forte piano that Beethoven had, Beethoven would never have thought of that music. He would never have thought of that kind of percussive, highly energized music if he couldn't sit down and hit something. And the harder he hit it, the louder it was. So I think, you know, there's no way to predict what kind of changes, whether they are in, you know, biological sciences or computers, or what are going to render us, you know, different kinds of musicians. There was another part to that question, I can't remember.
Well, I was particularly interested in how we might think about preparing young artists at this particular point.
Well, I was saying in Martin Bresnick's composition class this morning that I think it's wonderful that young composers that draw a lot from popular culture. They're much more open about it than they were when I was young, and they understand that the vitality of an art form really depends on how it absorbs the vernacular. Look at Andy Warhol, for example, and how Andy Warhol drew from cultural imagery and made an amazing contribution to the canon. What sometimes worries me is the tendency to be so bedazzled by pop culture that one neglects deep learning and really familiarizing oneself with all the great art. And I used my longtime collaborator Peter Sellers as a case in point of someone who, is a very edgy, provocative artist, but is so deeply knowledgeable in all the arts and literature and spirituality, and to me, that kind of all-encompassing knowledge and sensitivity is really what education should be providing.
If we look at the notion that the arts have the potential, at least, to build bridges of understanding between different peoples, different ideas, and the notion that the university is a place where agreeable dissent and creativity can coexist, how do you deal, and again, John, I'll start with you, particularly with selection of topics that in opera are certainly something that uses text that might have some controversy. How do you find this idea that resides and might be shabbily clothed at first, but then grows, and then we find the university in the role of being a type of social critic, if you will, or part of that?
Speaking to me about controversy.
I could be more specific.
Yeah. Well, I've done some theatrical works that have been attuned to what I consider to be, I guess, American versions of our own mythology. That in the time of medieval Germany, they had their myths, and the Greeks had their myths. And, it's wonderful when you read Plato, how often they refer to Homer, that everyone knows Homer. And it's very much like people who talk about the Old Testament. They define their lives by the myths in the Bible, or maybe some people feel they're truths in one way or another. But I feel that we as Americans, our mythology really comes from the news and from very, very significant public events, whether it's Lindbergh's flight or Pearl Harbor or the JFK assassination. All of these things constitute a kind of mythology, and we're constantly reminded of them in one way or another, through media, through novels, through films. So that is our kind of collective experience. And so the opera subjects that I and my collaborators have chosen, I think they really prod the collective unconscious of the society. I mean, the Nixon in China, it's wry and it's humorous, the idea, but it's also a dramatic work that embodies the collision of the two great ideas about how human beings should live. Should they live in a market economy where a monetary value can be placed on every interaction and every object, which is capitalism, or should they live in a social welfare state where everyone theoretically is cared for, no one goes hungry, no one becomes excessively wealthy? Of course, neither of those models perfectly work, but that's what Nixon in China was about. And Dr. Atomic, the opera about Robert Oppenheimer and the development of the atomic bomb, I mean, that was a perfect archetype to make a drama about, because the atomic bomb is the image of, you know, humanity's power, both the marvel of science and also the horrible danger of it, and what intellect and rationality can do if with and without moral guidance. And finally, The Death of Klinghoffer is about intolerance, and it's about terrorism, which of course is probably lamentably the major theme of our lifetime, or at least it has been for the last 20 years, and how Americans respond to that, and how people scream at each other and without listening.
And the university here, especially in our time, and your time has been a decade or more longer than mine, this has been a place where civility framed agreeable dissent. As president, how do you see that emerging for Yale and Yale's role in the international community?
Sure. So, you know, these issues of universities being a place where controversial ideas, where ideas that might offend us can be expressed and considered and thought about and debated, is always one that makes people uncomfortable. That because it flies in the face of another value that is also important, right? We want to be nice to each other. We want to be respectful to each other. We want to live in a place, in a community, I sometimes call Yale a village, where you don't walk around all the time feeling that you're under attack or about to be insulted or offended. The problem is, and C. Van Woodward, the great American historian who taught at Yale for many years and wrote a report on free expression in the 1970s, he said it best. He said, those are important values, don't get me wrong. This is a paraphrase. He said, those are important values, don't get me wrong. It's important. Mutual respect is important. Tolerance is important. Having friends and making friends is important. And they're all very important, and we should, as a university, try to encourage them. But we should never encourage them to the extent that it makes us reluctant to say things to each other that we might find offensive, challenging, troubling, difficult. Because universities have to be the place where you're willing to entertain those ideas. It's the only way we can push forward. It's the only way we can be creative. It's the only way ultimately to have impact. And so we have to, in a way, be willing to put up with a certain amount of discomfort. Now, that doesn't mean that we look for ways to make each other uncomfortable, right? Just because you have the right to, in Woodward's terms, to utter the unutterable, that doesn't mean you necessarily should look for every possible occasion to do so, right? It has to be in the service of some larger goal, seeking truth, being creative, finding something new. But when it is, we shouldn't hesitate to do it. And I gave my freshman welcoming address in Yale College this year on this topic because I think it's one that universities are having a hard time with right now. You may remember last spring, speakers at commencements were invited, and then there was student opposition to the speaker, and then the speaker would say, okay, I'm not coming then. And this can be left to the right, right to the left and right to the center. So this can defy political boundaries. And in different times in our histories, it's had a tendency to go more or less in one way or the other way. So I don't think of this as political. I think of this very much as a challenge to what is fundamentally important in universities, that we are an environment in which we are willing to listen to anything, even when it offends us. But then, by God, if it does, we have an obligation to speak back to it. When we hear speech we don't like, the solution is speech of our own in turn. So why?
Yeah.
Why? Because I think it's fundamental to change and creativity and progress. I think It doesn't happen under other circumstances nearly as easily.
So we make the circle, really. I mean, we come back to a place that honors art and creativity and honors the human being from which that springs. And I want to thank you both for sharing your thoughts and your comments with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take 2 or 3 questions from the audience, and there's a microphone over here. So if you have a question that you would like to direct either to John Adams or Peter Salovey, please come at this time, introduce yourself. Would help to know your major and affiliation or a little bit of background information. Please.
Hi. My name is Patrick Jankowski. I'm in the MMA program. I play the French horn. This question's for Mr. Adams. A few years ago, some of your pre-existing compositions were used in a film called I Am Love, an Italian film. I wonder if you can comment on the experience of seeing another artist associate your music with their art, and then I wonder if it changed your perspective on your own work.
Yeah, the film that he's mentioning is a film called I Am Love, which was produced by the wonderful actress Tilda Swinton, and was directed by a fairly young Italian director named Luca. I'm having trouble with names today. Sounds Italian. It'll come to me. It's a movie about a collapsing Milanese dynasty. Old patron, and watching all these terrible things with his kid. His daughter comes out, and another son is kind of sort of doesn't work out very well, and the family's collapsing, and his trophy bride, Russian wife, who's played by Tilda Swinton, who therefore has to speak Italian with a Russian accent, has an affair with the pastry chef. And so the film is fundamentally about food and sex. And I did not know that they were using my music. So one morning I woke up and saw in my inbox Tilda Swinton. But I get emails from Bill Clinton and Michelle Obama, so I figured it was junk mail. And then I looked at it again, and it was really from Tilda Swinton, and she was asking me, actually begging me to agree to let my music be used in the film. And so I went and met her and saw the film. And yeah, it was fun. They used a lot of different little segments from my music, and I frequently say that you can only babysit your creations so long. You have to let them out in the world and let them do their own thing. And I thought that by and large the director he did a very sensitive thing. There was one use of the ending of a piece of mine called Harmony Lair, which I thought sort of amped up the hysteria of the piece in a way that I never would have expected my piece to be. But that just shows you how different other people experience your work.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Philip Jameson. I'm a junior in Yale College, and I'm a music major. I compose. So tomorrow you're conducting one of your own works in the concert. I was wondering whether you could comment on what that's like, and whether, if given the choice, you like to do it yourself or hand it over to someone else.
Well, both. I've been very fortunate. I've had some of the great conductors in the world do my music, like Simon Rattle and Michael Tilson Thomas, and this wonderful, brilliant Venezuelan conductor, Gustavo Dudamel. So that's a real thrill. But I also really like to do it myself. And until recently, most composers did conduct. Stravinsky did, and of course Mahler was a great conductor. And there's nothing like having hands-on experience doing your music, because you find out what's good about it and what's not good about it and what's practical and what's not. And I'm constantly taking my pieces back after doing a concert of them and tweaking them. I also really love to do other music because that informs my, the deepest part of myself. And it also, it's just incredible to be in touch with another composer. So for the concert I'm doing at Wolsey Hall tomorrow night includes the Beethoven Fourth Symphony, it's just an incredible, wonderful piece of music with just immense energy and joy and subtlety and lyricism. And I've known it all my life, but it just to actually be able to do it, and particularly be able to teach it to young players who, I love the Levi Strauss phrase, the raw and the cooked. And the first time these kids play a phrase from Beethoven, it's frequently very raw. They got all the right notes and the right rhythm, but it just, it just doesn't have meaning. And so bringing that out and developing it has been an incredible experience.
Thanks, Phil. We have time for another question or two. Anyone? Chris?
Thank you. I always have a question. I was interested to hear what President Salovey had to say about emotional manipulation in the lab being an ethical kind of issue. And I'm wondering if John could talk a little bit about emotional ambition for a piece of music and that tension in terms of the manipulation when, for instance, there's an emotional ambition, if you think that feeling is at the heart of expression and communication, when does the emotional ambition set in?
Yeah.
And what is the tension between that and what President Salovey was saying about emotional manipulation?
Well, I was telling Peter before we came on stage that I read his book at a very critical point, at a time in my life when I was feeling very insecure about the kind of composer I am, because I am a very feeling type. Jung would classify me as a feeling type, and people who are feeling types usually have undeveloped thinking functions, and vice versa. People who have very highly evolved feeling functions sometimes don't do well with their emotions. So I do think that music is incredibly powerful. And I was speaking to an analysis class this morning, and I was trying to drive home the point that music is the most psychologically precise of all the art forms, much more so than poetry or any literary form, because it describes an emotional state with incredible precision in the way that words or gesture or any other human activity can't do. You have to think about that. I mean, I won't try to go in to give examples, but just think about how precise it is. And I mean, the case in point has to do with what's been going on with my opera, The Death of Klinghoffer, where some people have become violently upset about the concept that it would be, a very delicate political situation like the struggle between the Palestinians and the Israelis would become the subject of an opera. And one highly esteemed musicologist actually wrote a very strong condemnation of the opera in the pages of the New York Times, in which he analyzed the piece, and his point being that music is so potent that it, in certain cases, needs to be controlled. And he makes a distinction which I've never quite understood between control and censorship. But he believes that, in a situation where, potential political harm could be done, or people could be persuaded to, have bad thoughts, bad thoughts about Jews, or bad thoughts about Muslims, or bad thoughts about black people or something, that if music is employed to drive home that point, then it should be controlled. And of course, this is what happened with the Metropolitan Opera, because they were confronted by people who, many of whom didn't even know the opera, but who had decided that it was potentially anti-Semitic, and they went to the Met and demanded that the international telecast be canceled, just foreclosed without any discussion. And I think, what that was in a way was an acknowledgement of people's fear of the emotional power of music, even though I think it was completely wrong-headed, because the opera is nothing of the sort, as most people who've seen it. But it's funny how a slogan can kind of catch fire, and then everybody signs on to it without actually having experienced what the reality of it is.
One final announcement. John Adams conducting Philharmonia Orchestra of Yale, Woolsey Hall, tomorrow night, 7:30. And then Sunday at Avery Fisher Hall at 5 p.m. If you hear it in Woolsey, you are going to want to go to New York and hear it again. I hope you will come with even more frequency, John, in the future than you have in the past, which has been, to our advantage, very frequent. We think of you as you are. You're part of Yale. After all, you have a doctorate from Yale. And
so I have the best of all possible worlds.
You have the best of an education from Harvard and a doctorate from Yale, to paraphrase a famous president. But it's particularly good, I think, to have someone like you come here and work with the best composition department in the world, too. And you inspire our composers who will go forward and do great things, but also our orchestra players that you've been able to work with. We are deeply thankful to you. And to you, President Salovey, for your support, the encouragement, and the understanding you have of music and art at Yale. Thank you both. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you so much.